Hi everyone, I'm with Dave Seibel, investment advisor and author of the new book, Don't Run Out of Money. Okay, David, so tell me, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, Mike, there was really a few things. First, I guess it was somewhere around 2013-14, I had written an article that was published on foxbusiness.com. And the article had some pretty positive reviews. People that had read it, liked the thought process, and that was really the precursor to the book. And then, of course, having dinner and drinks one night with a bunch of friends who had read the book, they said, you know, you should write a book. Well, as you know, don't say something unless you're going to commit to it. And once I said, yeah, that's a good idea, from there it was, okay, when's the book coming out? So once I got into the whole process of writing the book, I realized that if I was going to go through this, I wanted to do a book that really was going to have an impact. Too many of the books I see that are out there written by advisors are little pamphlets that are nothing more than a book version of their presentation, usually attempting to sell a product or drive people into something. And I didn't want to do that. I noticed since getting into this business that there's just a lot of misconceptions and a lot of misinformation that's out there that's really driving people to do things that maybe aren't the smartest things in the world. So I wanted to attack that, and I also wanted to get to the point where I got people to refocus their attention into what was important and away from a lot of the things that we just are bombarded with on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. Now, another one of the issues that came up as I got into this business and even through today is people talking about a retirement crisis. There's articles written about it all the time. There's news stories about it all the time. And when you look at it on the surface, you say, yeah, there must be something there. You always hear about the 10,000 people who are turning 65 every day. Social Security and Medicare are a mess. Cost of health care is going up seemingly every year. And one of the more interesting and troubling statistics that I saw was that the average family of retirement age has less than $12,000 in savings. That, you would think, is a bit of a crisis. When I really started looking into it and said what's going on, and when I started really researching for the book, what I found was one of the biggest problems is just that the rules of retirement have changed. And you know, back in the day, our grandparents, maybe even our parents, they worked for a company for a long time. They retired with a nice pension, Social Security. They had no debt. Their house was paid for. So they had a good idea, you know, what their situation was. You know, this is what I call the big number versus the small number. Our parents and grandparents, when they looked at their pensions and they looked at Social Security, they were looking at the small number. That was the monthly number that they needed to live on or that they had to live on. The problem is now that pensions have kind of gone the way of T-Rex, and they're just, you know, more and more companies are getting rid of them every year, that we've replaced the pensions with things like 401ks and IRAs, which unfortunately, when they were developed and designed, were never meant to be replacements for a pension. Mm-hmm. Well, the big difference is when we had a pension, the focus was on the little number. Now with 401ks and IRAs, the focus is on the big number. So people are more concerned not with how much do they need to live on each month in retirement, but how big is their account balance. The other, I think, bigger problem in a way is the fact that pensions, those funds were professionally managed. They were managed to a number. So they weren't managed for maximum return. They were managed to the expected return that they needed to fund the liabilities in the pension. A little technical, but you know, it's really not just saying we want this to grow as big as we can. But it was done with professionals, by professionals. The problem now is you manage your retirement. In your 401k or your IRA, you are solely responsible for managing those assets. And the problem is that we are putting complex financial decisions in the hands of people and requiring them to make these complex financial decisions. And most people just aren't qualified to do that. There's your crisis.
Okay, well, technology obviously really kind of controls things now. How has technology impacted the way people react with regards to their money?
Well, I think that another big problem that we have in this world is that we do have access to unlimited information. Since the days of the dot-com boom, when the internet and all this information became fully accessible to everyone, anybody can go out and find out anything about anything at any time by just pulling their phone out of their pocket. I think the biggest problem that this has done is it's given people, because they have access to this information, it's giving people a false sense of their ability. You know, as Americans, we think that we have all this knowledge and that we can make all these decisions, but it's really troubling that Americans rank 14th in the world in financial literacy. In the book, I go into two different studies which look at both retirement age individuals and also millennials. So you have two different ends of the life cycle. And in both cases, when given tests about financial or retirement issues, they both failed miserably. Even after being confronted with the results, in both cases, both groups still felt that their knowledge about financial topics was at a higher level, and a much higher level than it really is. I think one of the things is that with all this information, with access to the financial media and all the shows and everything online and all the so-called experts and the free advice crowd that we hear from, that it's kind of turned us all into what I call in the book bobbleheads. And what's a bobblehead? Well, I see this unfortunately all the time when I'm sitting with a family in my office, and I'll say something and I'll catch myself, and people will just sit, regardless of what you say, they'll just sit there and nod their head. And I'll call people out on that. And I think what it is, it's an issue that people think, because they have access to all this information, they think they should understand it, or they should be able to have a conversation about it. And this just, when you stop and think about it, you realize how ridiculous that is. But yet people will do it all the time. They hear the same thing over and over and over again, so they assume that it must be true. The old wives' tales, the conventional wisdom, the rules of thumb, these are now accepted without question. And the problem is, a lot of these things are just market myths. They're not really financial laws, and that's a real problem.
I often hear people talk about beating the market. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, when somebody says that to me and they talk about beating the market, or we're talking about, usually it's when somebody comes in and we're sitting down and talking about what they do currently. And they may be with an advisor and they may be upset about their performance, and they talk about beating the market. And I often ask them, okay, well, what exactly does that mean? Because what it's come to mean from our perspective is that you beat the performance of the S&P 500. Well, as you probably know, the S&P 500 is just a little swath of the total market. 500 large cap stocks and that's it. Well, what about small cap, mid cap, international, emerging markets, fixed income, emerging market debt, municipal bonds, whatever you want to, I mean, there's just a whole world of market out there. But we've said that this is the market and we need to beat this piece of the market. Normally what I do is I'll follow that up with a question when somebody says, you know, they talk about beating the market, and I'll say, why do you think you need to beat the market? How has this even become a thing, and why is it important? And usually the response to that is, you know, because they think they need to. Well, my question to everyone and to these people is beating the market your goal? I mean, when you talk about retirement, you talk about any part of your financial life, is simply beating the market your goal, or is there something else? Or do you have other goals in life that you want to obtain? And I guess the bigger question is, once we establish that, does beating the market necessarily mean that you're going to achieve your goals? Because the obvious question is, we've gotten spoiled over the last 10 years with the market, but what if we have a bad market? What if we have a bear market for an extended period of time that we haven't seen in quite a while? Does that necessarily mean that you're not going to achieve your goals? The two are separate. So I really try my best to get people out of that mindset of thinking they have to beat the market. It's about achieving your goals.
Well, do you have any advice for people who want to do it themselves?
Yeah, I do. There's a lot, and this is something that's really happened as a result of the .com and the technology that's come out of that. Obviously, we saw it back in the .com boom with all the people that thought they could become day traders. We know how that ended. And I think it's kind of funny when you watch the commercials, because the commercials kind of follow the market. When the market's good, they're talking about trading and trading tools and you know, trading more. When the market's bad, they talk about other things, about protection and other stuff like that. I'll answer a question with a question, and normally what I'll say to somebody, actually more of a statement, is, you know, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And what people need to understand is that the deck is stacked against them. The financial services companies, the brokers, you know, however you want to refer to it, they're not there to help you make money. It may seem like that, but they're not. They're there they have one goal, like any business. Their goal is to make a profit. And what you need to understand, and what everybody needs to understand, is that you are the source of that profit. There's a lot more to being successful in investing, in achieving your goals, than just trolling the web for investment ideas or following the latest rants on Kramer.
In your book, you talk about proper planning for retirement. Can you go into that with a little bit more detail?
Sure. Planning is, when we talk about financial planning, there's a lot of different methodologies and things. And in the book, I go into the different methodologies that are available and that people use for financial planning. But I think that one of the things that people need to realize is that having a financial plan is much different than having a portfolio or a financial product. One of the things I say in the book, actually every time it's in bold, is a portfolio or a financial product is not a financial plan. And oftentimes I will ask people if they have a financial plan, and they'll bring, you know, when they bring it in for me to review, it's actually an account statement. Well, financial planning, the goal of financial planning, as I said before, is to focus on your goals, not your investments. It's not an investment discussion. So when we talk about goals, one of the first things to realize when we talk about the book is basically primarily deals with retirement and retirement income planning. One of the first things that people have to realize is retirement is not a goal. Okay, this goes back to the big number, small number. Mm-hmm. We need to plan for that small number. Planning for a big number, there's all sorts of problems with that, because how do you convert that big number to a small number, to your monthly income, without having a chance of it running out? So the first thing we need to do is focus on your goals. What are your lifestyle goals? You know, everybody, and it's funny because most people, when I have people in the office for the first time, our first conversation that I'll have with a family focuses around their goals, because I want to know, what is it that you really want when you retire? Where do you want to live? What kind of house do you want to live in? What is it that you want to do with your time? Do you want to travel? Do you just want to stay home and watch the grandkids? Everybody's different, everybody's unique, so there is no one boilerplate, if you will. I have a goal for people. Everybody, I always tell that if we're going to work together, I do have one goal that everybody has to accept. And that's that regardless, working together, we need to develop a plan that regardless of what happens in the world, what happens in the market, what happens in politics in Washington, and all the craziness that goes on, independent of all that stuff, we have to develop a plan wherever possible that under no circumstance can you run out of money. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have enough money, but as I go into quite often, there's a big difference between having, not having enough money and actually running out of money. And there's a very big difference. One of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give is that there's no shortcuts. This process that we go through looks at cash flow, it looks at, basically creates your personal financial statements, projects things out to the first year of your retirement from where you are now. We go through a pretty exhaustive analysis to try to take as much variability out of the process as possible. Unfortunately, that what's available now on just about every financial site, media site, places that you wouldn't even expect to find them, they have retirement calculators. I call them the black boxes. And if you really look, there's all sorts of things on there, disclosures, disclaimers, things like that say, okay, these are almost like saying these are for entertainment purposes only. I think they say they're for educational purposes only. They're not meant to provide any advice, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, people, just like they never read a prospectus, they don't look at the fine print either. So what happens is people plug their numbers in and they get an answer back, and in most cases they go into panic mode. I can't tell you how many families I've had in here that have looked at this and done these things. We actually, in the book, we did an analysis which looked at a bunch of these and saw that the results were literally off by millions of dollars given the same fictitious client that we built. The numbers of issues with these, I could probably fill a book with the number of issues with these things. I guess that the advice or the question I could ask people is, does it really make sense that you can take your situation, which we're all unique, we all have a different situation, and most of them are complicated, and that we can take that situation, our lives, boil it down to, in most cases, 4, maybe 5 numbers that we put into a calculator, hit a button, and spit out an answer that has any sense of reasonableness or usefulness. And the thing is that, you get an answer from that, then what? Mm-hmm. And one thing I always explain to people is, the result of your financial plan should never be the question, now what? So My advice is when you see the ads for the 30-second, or now I saw one for a 15-second financial plan, this is where you should really kind of let your common sense take over and say, does that really make sense?
So once you have this plan in place, I mean, is that it? You just kind of put it in the drawer and just leave it there?
Oh no, and that's unfortunately what we see very often is in the past, people have gotten a financial plan, the merits of which we won't go into. Many of them are just sales tools, but they get a financial plan and it gets stuck in the drawer on a bookshelf. Maybe they look at it every now and then, blow the dust off it. But it's out of date the minute that they get it. You need, a financial plan needs to be a living document. You have 15 years, let's say, from today to retirement. If you get an answer today, well, that's going to change. There's so many things that are going to change between now and that time. If you don't use it as a living document, how else is it going to have any value? So one of the things I insist on is annual reviews with my clients, especially as we get closer to retirement. It's even more important. What I like to tell people is that when you do proper planning, the biggest determinant of your success or failure is not the market. It's you. Did you save what you said you were going to save? Did your spending stay at the level that you said it was going to stay at? And the only way that we can know this is by tracking it annually, by looking at it annually, by replacing the estimates with actuals, by looking at the trends. By knowing that we're 3-4 years into a plan and we're starting to trend below where we need to be, what do we need to do to get that back? What do we need to do to make that up? Or can't we? Was it because of a job loss or something else that was out of your control? These are the things that we can work on going forward so that you know that, okay, how do we get back to where we need to be? And the answer may be working a little longer if you want to still achieve your goals, or maybe you have to dial back your expectations. But in any event, no matter what it shows, we want to make sure that we know that 5-10 years in advance of retirement, and not what most people do. And I have a friend that's in this situation now that we've been talking about getting together now for probably a couple years, and he's about 6 months away from retirement, and finally said, "Hey Dave, I need to come in and see you." I'm like, that's great. And that's when I tell them, just remember, sometimes you get to pick your goals, and sometimes your goals get to pick you. He's in the situation, I think he's going to be fine, but he's in the situation where his goals have now picked him, because there's not much we can do once the papers are filed. So I think that when you look at an annual review, and when we contrast it, when I talk to people and they talk about the annual review that they have with their advisor, usually it's a broker, an investment guy, and they go in and what do? They talk about the investments. And the conversations usually go the same. I've heard these conversations, they've been relayed to me. And it's, you sit down in a room, you're there with your wife, and you sit down and you talk to the guy, and one of two things happened. He, meaning the portfolio, either beat the market, whatever that means, or it didn't. Well, if it did, they're talking about, basically high fives and everything else, and you walk out happy for another year. You didn't beat the market, perhaps the conversations about things like volatility or China or Trump or aliens or global warming or whatever it happens to be, there's a reason why they didn't beat the market. And you still feel good. You probably got some chocolate chip cookies and a cup of coffee out of the deal, and you still feel good and you walk out for another year. But once again, does any of that have anything to do with whether you're going to achieve your goals. And that's why I think the biggest difference, again, changing the mindset, is getting off of the investments and getting on and worrying more about you and your goals and what you can control.
Thank you, David. I appreciate your time. And
Pleasure.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess the biggest advice that I can give to people is to start. We are notoriously bad at planning. We procrastinate. I can't tell you how many people that we speak to who on a regular basis say, oh, I've got to get in and see you. I've got this issue, I've got that issue, we've got to get in and see you. 6 months later, they still haven't come in. I think a lot of it is because people think that the die is cast. Maybe this goes back to 2008 and the financial crisis and what people did during that time. They stayed the course, they sold. Unfortunately, I see a lot of people who went to cash and are still there, missed this entire market. They feel that the die is cast again, that they can't change it, and they feel that maybe they'll never be able to retire. And what I regularly find is that oftentimes it's just not true. That because we've developed this big number mentality, people who don't have what they think is a big number, and I think most people think they need $1 million or $2 million to retire, and that's just not true. It's more determinant of them. I see a lot of people who just don't spend a lot of money. They live well within their means and they have no debt. And for them, they don't need that much money to retire. Once you include Social Security, maybe a pension, a small pension that they may have. So the biggest advice is just start, plan, do the hard work. It may be a little bit of work at the beginning, but if it's not, is it really worth it? And I think people need to focus on their goals. Think about that. It's not the investments, it's the goals. Focus on what you want in life. Do the work. And you know what? At the end of the day, when you go through the process, more often than not, I find that people are thoroughly surprised at the fact that they're in better shape than they think they are. And that's satisfying for me when we can work with somebody who just doesn't think they're in great shape, and you find out, okay, you're going to have an okay retirement. You're going to be able to achieve your goals. And that makes this worth it, and hopefully this book can just get people to focus on more than just the market. My biggest advice, turn the TV off.
Great. Again, the book is Don't Run Out of Money. I'm with David Seibel. Thank you for joining me.